You're listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
Hello, welcome to our latest PMI-based podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm Paul Smith, Economics Director in the team that produces PMI figures for over 40 countries and key regions across the world. Now, today's podcast is one that focuses on the economic impacts of weather and how PMI and other survey data can be useful at picking up these events either in a timely fashion or helping us to assess behavioural changes as nations transition to greener and more efficient forms of energy. Our thematic choice for this episode has largely been driven by the observation that 2023 has seen some strong impacts from extreme weather across the world, be it unusually long and intense wildfires in Canada, to extreme heat in southern Europe, to a dry climate heavily impacting crop yields in Southeast Asia and Australia. Outside of the tragic human impacts of these events, all have in some way or another shown up in our PMI data. Now, joining me today to discuss some of these themes are two fellow economists from the PMI team. Firstly, we have our regular podcaster, Economics Director Andrew Harker. And secondly, I'm joined by Phil Smith, Economics Associate Director with S&P. A warm welcome to you both. And Phil, if I could come to you first maybe and ask you to give us an update on current PMI developments in Germany.
Of course, yeah, thanks very much for having me. So the situation in Germany, it's not great at the moment in terms of the direction of travel of the economy. The August composite PMI, which is a measure of the combined output of manufacturing and services sectors, fell to its lowest since May 2020. This was a result of a deepening downturn in manufacturing production, combined with a renewed contraction in the services side of the economy. Services had previously been a support to the economy, but the PMI showed activity falling for the first time this year in August, which panelists told us was a result of a squeeze on customer budgets due to persistently high inflation, as well as an uncertain general economic outlook, which was weighing on demand. The PMI numbers tally with some actually pretty miserable official data out in the last few weeks as well. Factory new orders fell particularly sharply in July. Now, this unwound a spike in orders in May, June, when the data had been somewhat skewed by a jump in big ticket orders. But the sharp drop in July in the official numbers brought that series back into line with what we're seeing in the PMI. Now, I suppose the big question at this point is, where are we heading? We're not in the business of making forecasts, but we can look at some of the sub-indices to get hints of where we might be heading in the coming months. The manufacturing new orders index pretty much stabilized in August, albeit at a very low level. We also saw manufacturers' expectations tick up, albeit again remaining in pessimism territory. Now, these could be signs that the manufacturing sector is sort of reaching a bottom, but of course it'd be wrong to draw strong conclusions on just one set of results, and so we'll have to look for the next release to see if those trends are continuing. And we also saw services expectations tick up in August, but given the direction of activity and new business in that sector, I don't think we'll be seeing much of a recovery until perhaps the early part of next year.
Yeah, that's really useful background context, and it doesn't seem like a great outlook at the moment. And just my experience of working on the PMIs in recent years is one potential risk factor that's emerged more recently, it seems, or more frequently, has been how the Rhine River has tended to be in terms of water levels and things like that, largely because of the importance of the Rhine to industries like the chemical sector and its potential impact on industrial performance. What's your current read of the situation? Any potential risks from where the Rhine is at the moment?
But I think it's probably worth starting with a quick geography lesson for anyone listening who might not be familiar with the Rhine's route through Europe. So it originates in Switzerland, where it passes through Basel. Then it moves northwards along the Germany-France border, passing through Strasbourg. It continues north through the west side of Germany, passing through many key towns and cities, Colm, Düsseldorf, before it veers off west into the Netherlands, passing through Rotterdam and eventually emptying into the North Sea. Just from that list of place names, you can get a real sense of the importance of this river to industry across a large part of Europe. It's really vital, as you say, Paul, in the transportation of a whole range of raw materials, oil products, coal, iron ore. Yeah, it's relied on by a huge number of manufacturers in Europe. With the Rhine, problems start to arise when you get periods of low rainfall, which leads obviously levels on the river to start to drop, making it difficult for certain parts of the river to be navigated. We saw this in 2018 and again briefly in 2022. We had a situation where vessels couldn't carry full loads. And what this does is obviously it means greater need for more vessels, each carrying a lighter load. So you get potentially a constriction on the amount of goods that can be delivered, thus impacting output. But also you get supply, demand imbalances in transport capacity. So you get surcharges start to rise. Now, these sort of effects, they did come through in the survey data, not only for Germany, but for the Netherlands too. So yeah, it's something we've been aware of for some time. Now, in terms of the current context, what we're seeing this year, the Rhine hit historically low levels for the time of year, both in February, March, and then again in July, which got a lot of people quite nervous about where we're headed in the second half of the year when the river tends to be at its lowest historically. Heavy rainfall during July and into August actually saw the river level spike higher. And as we talk now, it's still slightly above its sort of recent historical average. So for the time being, things are looking okay, but it's certainly something worth watching for the rest of the year and beyond that as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think of something like that natural impact of the ups and downs of the Rhine can have such an effect on industrial production in Europe. Something else that can have an impact on, say, supply chains and therefore industrial production is flooding, which is maybe a bit more unpredictable as well. So I know, Paul, you noticed in Italy there was some floods earlier this year, weren't there, which had an impact on the manufacturing sector. So it'd be good to get an update from you on what actually were the main impacts there.
You're right. It was really back in May, largely northern Italy and the areas where the River Po kind of flows through, the opposite to the Rhine, equally starting in the Alps region and then flowing through northern Italy through a really important area like Emilia-Romagna, a very important agricultural area for Italy. I think something like 40% of Italy's food production comes from that kind of region. We'd seen a period of exceptionally dry weather, and then in May there was something like 6 months of rainfall in 3 days, so very heavy. And you can imagine when you get such heavy rainfall on top of very dry soil, you have drainage challenges, and then equally rivers tended to overflow, spill over banks, etc. And that led what we picked up in our data was reports of roads and bridges collapsing, having issues around new transportation for, like I say, quite an important area of Italy. We tend to focus on initial impacts, but equally they continue for many months afterwards sometimes. So this month with our August PMIs, we found in the construction sector, we had people or constructors reporting they were getting orders to repair damaged property from floods. And then equally in our services data, we had reports of food prices up, largely, again, because of the adverse impact of flooding earlier in the year. Now that helped push cost inflation in the Italian services economy up to its highest since April, which doesn't sound like too big a peak or a high, but of course it just adds to a little bit of unexpected stickiness given where price inflation currently is in Europe. Still is quite elevated, so a tick up just adds to that view of a little bit of stickiness in what otherwise has been a recent downward trend in price inflation.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about agriculture there and food prices, because another sort of naturally occurring weather event that we've got at the moment is El Nino is coming around again this year, and that again is going to have an impact on agricultural prices potentially. Normally in an El Nino cycle, you'd see agricultural output decrease, and so thinking back to our supply and demand economics 101 that would normally feed through to higher prices. Potentially something else to watch out for when it comes to food prices, potentially a big issue for countries and consumers that are reliant on or exposed to changes in food prices. That's something that our different teams within global intelligence and analytics are going to be looking at closely over the coming months, or already looking at as well. So I'd encourage our listeners to look out for any research that comes out from our different teams across the world, looking at the specific impacts of El Nino on their regions as we go forwards.
I was having a look at that a couple of days ago, and there's some really great forward-looking stuff in there I think really would help clients and users thinking about these potential impacts down the line. That's on potential for prices. One thing, and we hinted a little bit in our German discussion there about potential for disruption to output. Have you seen, Andrew, any other impacts of extreme weather impacting on current output levels around the world?
Yeah, if we move away from some European examples for now and look at Asia, earlier this year, back in around June time, there was a real heat wave in Vietnam, and that caused quite a lot of power outages, which really impacted manufacturing production. It came through in our manufacturing survey for June and sort of really exacerbated a downturn that was going on in Vietnam at the time. But even more recently, and on a similar theme, our August data in mainland China showed that there were some reports of extreme heat leading to shorter working weeks. So yeah, definitely having an impact on output when you get those sorts of extreme scenarios. It's worth saying, I think the mainland China PMI data was above 50 this month, so it's showing still growth, but just maybe limiting the extent to which growth is being achieved at the moment when you get these sorts of events coming along.
Obviously, we just talked a little bit there about current output, but inevitably, as these weather events become more frequent or more intense, companies also have to think a little bit forward into the future, really. Our Canadian panelists, for instance, have been reporting in recent months that they're paying for a reduced frequency and intensity of wildfires in the coming year, largely because they've seen the business impact, maybe an adverse impact on tourism numbers or something like that. Equally, I guess there's also an investment angle to look at, isn't there, here as well, potentially for mitigation against these climate impacts, but also how we're going to think about our transition to greener, more efficient energy consumption in the years ahead. And that's something I see quite often in our business outlook surveys, where we ask a bunch of forward-looking questions to our PMI panelists 3 times a year. I think the next release is in November, so that'll be something definitely to look out for. Like I say, as panelists think a little bit more ahead, rather with the PMI, which is all about today's conditions. I think that's for you, Phil. You've been sitting there patiently listening to me and Andrew there discuss a few things. I know that in the UK at the moment, you've been doing some work where you've been surveying households and their changing attitudes towards energy efficiency in their homes. Maybe you could explain a little bit more about your research in that area.
Absolutely. So we've been collecting data for NatWest for the Greener Homes Attitude Tracker. The name does give it away a bit, but what that is exactly is it's a monthly survey of 1,500 UK individuals. It's a representative sample of the population. The survey is intended to anticipate changes in consumer behaviour and sentiment towards the green transition in the UK housing market, as you mentioned, Paul. It's a survey we've been running since May 2021. Yeah, we've got about 2.5 years, so we started a bit of a pretty decent time series for that one now.
So it feels quite rare to have a time series in this kind of work and in this kind of space. What's your latest results? What are the latest data points showing?
The latest data points are for the second quarter. And what they showed is that at the moment, energy efficiency around the home is a nice to have feature. So we asked people looking to buy a house in the next 10 years, what factors are important. So 40% of people looking to buy a property in the next 10 years said that an energy performance certificate rating, so that's essentially a measure of a property's energy efficiency. The EPC rating was a very important factor in 40% of cases. So to give that some sort of context, 68% said that the cost of a property was a very important factor, and 63% said location. So the 40% it's pretty sizable, but it's not up there with the likes of location and cost at the moment. We're also tracking plans for green home improvements. So around 1 in 5 homeowners said they plan to make sustainable upgrades to their property in the next 12 months, and around 2/3 said they'd plan to make upgrades in the next 10 years as a whole. In terms of the items looking to install, the longer term outlook, as you can imagine, it's more big ticket items such as electric vehicle charging points and solar panels, each cited by around 40%. In the very near term, we're looking at smaller items. So smart energy meters are the number one priority in the next 12 months.
Oh, it's really interesting to think about as someone who's buying a house at the moment. Hopefully, then it makes me think, how much importance did I put on the EPC rating? Given the EPC rating is pretty bad on the one I'm buying, obviously not too much. Then again, as you were saying, there's those mitigation or those improvements you can make to try and improve it once you're in there, can't you? There's one thing I was just wondering about is, to what extent the recent pressures we've seen on cost of living have impacted the results? Because I think that's something that we've seen not just in the UK, but all around the world, is that those sorts of cost of living pressures that have been quite acute really in the past year or two now. Has that really impacted on the results and how people feel about energy efficiency and these sorts of improvements?
Yeah, it has. So as I mentioned, we have a decent amount of history now in this series, so we can really track changes in behaviours across time. So let's take us right back to the start of the series, really. In 2021, we saw a bit of an uplift in plans for improvement around the home around the time of COP26. So it seemed that event really raised awareness in the area of sort of sustainability. Not long after that, we had the beginning of the war in Ukraine and all the issues around potential energy security worries in the UK and the potential for energy prices to spike higher in the future. And that, again, we saw people react to that and bring forward their plans for making these changes. For a large part of the series, we saw general upturn in awareness and plans for the future. However, when we reached the winter just gone, when energy prices started to spike like they did and inflation soared, it was noticeable that people were starting to really tighten their purse strings. For the first time in the series history, we actually saw plans for sustainable home improvements suffer a bit of a setback. But yeah, it definitely seems it's coming through in the data, this cost of living pressures, and making people think twice about what they can afford and if they really need to make changes right now. We have seen a slight recovery in the latest data, but we're not back to the level we were before the energy crisis really struck. But interestingly, away from the housing side of things, we also track general actions that households are taking to tackle sustainability issues. And one thing we saw again over the winter just gone was that people were less considerate of the environment when shopping. We saw a drop in the proportion that said that they were considering the environment when doing their shopping. So it seemed that there was a turn away from that environmental consideration, more towards choosing value over anything else. Yeah, we are seeing some noticeable effects in the data.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting, all the different sort of breakdowns and splits that we can get and how we can track those attitudes and actions over time. It's a really interesting report. So when's the next one, Phil? When can we expect to see the next update?
So I think the next one's to be out early part of next year. We're looking at January for Q4 results. But yeah, it's worth keeping an eye in January for those.
Fantastic stuff. So thank you for that. I think these types of surveys and understanding how households and firms, of course, how their behavioural changes, is understanding these trends is only going to grow in importance as we measure and evaluate our progress towards net zero targets over the coming years. Just summing up and coming back to our earlier PMI discussion, just to reiterate, the best way to see how weather impacts economies or indeed any other events is really to keep a careful abreast of our PMI data. Just to those listeners new to our surveys and how our release schedule works, figures are usually released after the end of a reference month for manufacturing services and in some instances construction sectors across the world. Although I will note in some instances we actually release preview or what we call flash readings for several countries, regions around a week before the end of the month. This PMI data really is the first look at how economies are faring around the world on a monthly basis. So I guess just looking at the calendar, the next set of releases to watch out for is September the 22nd. We'll be covering economic developments in Australia, Japan, the Eurozone, the UK and the United States. But for now, my thanks to Andrew and Phil for their contributions today after what felt another useful, engaging discussion on the PMIs and, of course, some of that wider research that we conduct here at S&P Global. Please do head over to our PMI webpage on the S&P Global website to see some of our other research and resources. But in the meantime, I look forward to chairing another PMI podcast later in the year.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.